Okay. The recording says it's doing its thing, so we'll take it at its word. But imagine you took somebody at their word once. You trusted a colleague at work to get you their assignment, their portion of the work to you on time, and the day comes, it doesn't arrive, and you get in trouble because you weren't able to complete your work without the piece they were going to give you. And so your boss chews you out, you go back to your office or cubicle, depending upon where you are in the hierarchy, and you sit and you plot your revenge, right? So that the next time the person who stiffed you asks you for something, you're like, yes, of course I'll have it for you, absolutely, no problem. And then you just call in sick that day and sit home watching Netflix going, I know they're just twisting in the wind, suffering under the boss's withering gaze. Yes? Or do we just have fantasies about doing those sorts of things? Well, are you saying you've never actually carried out an act of revenge? Why not? What's that? A revenge, it seems like it might feel good, yes? Feels good for yourself, but not so much for God, right? There is that whole section in Mishpatim and other parts where it says, don't take revenge, right? Do not bear a grudge and do not take revenge, which is what's going to make the section of the Torah that we're reading today a little more surprising, because it's about taking revenge. Yeah. You didn't know we had a good mafia hit story going in the Torah? Well, this is the section right at the end of the book of Bamidbar, right at the end of the book of Numbers, and a lot of people are already skipping ahead to Deuteronomy because they want to do the whole summary part. But there are some very interesting episodes that are nestled right in these last few chapters, and we're going to look at one of them. At least I hope you find it interesting. We are on chapter 31 of the book of Numbers, which is page 943 if you're using the Eitz Chaim. And we're right at the bottom, which means go ahead and get your finger ready to flip the page. Because we're going to start off with the Lord spoke, which doesn't really tell you much about the individual episode just yet. All right, so we're chapter 31, Book of Bamidbar, also known as page 943. And we got our standard reader on standby.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, avenge the Israelite people on the Midianites, then you shall be gathered to your kin.
All right. So what do we got here?
Take revenge.
Take revenge.
Revenge.
What's that?
It's illegal.
This is apparently illegal revenge, but the word that's used here is venge, right? It's an interesting, again, Hebrew construct that kind of gets smoothed out a little bit in the English. Anybody who's looking at the start of verse 2, what are those like first two words? Well, the second word is part of a construct trying to say, right? It's sort of trying to say, avenge the vengeance of the children of Israel. Right?
What happened in the last parasha.
Right, so we are taking vengeance
For what they did to us.
for what they did to the people of Israel, right? And what did they do to the people of Israel? Anyone have a long memory?
They
Last
sent the
week?
women in and they had them bow to idols.
Yeah.
All right, so using the allure of feminine companionship, to be diplomatic, they seduced a large number of men into worshiping their idols. And that was considered to be very mean. And so therefore, now that we have stopped that was stopped with the old Pinchas spear spike, we're now going to take vengeance for what they had done. Make sense?
More like executing not revenge, but more like
It's justice.
justice.
It's justice. It's not vengeance, it's justice, which is what everybody says. When, what he did to me, I'm just getting justice by doing back to him.
But didn't the Israelite people get the message when Pinchas put the spear through the two of them and everything stopped and they stopped doing it? Wasn't the message already there? Do they need more vengeance?
Well, don't you? So hold on a second. Wait a minute. So you're saying that if a foreign military attacked the United States, blew up a city, and left, we wouldn't need to do anything else. So they went, okay, we're done. Sorry.
No, no.
Yeah, we blew up that city, but now we're done. So we didn't actually want a war. We did what we wanted and we're done. We just didn't like Chicago. Right? The Canadians blew up Chicago. Right? Would we say, okay? I mean, remember, after Pearl Harbor, to take a very concrete example, the Japanese weren't necessarily engaging in an all-out war with America. They hoped that America wouldn't engage in a war because they felt weakened by that attack, and therefore the Eastern Pacific would be free for Japanese conquest. Should we have simply said, oh, you know what? Pearl Harbor was bad. Shame on you, Japan. But since you're not attacking us anymore, we don't have any more interest in going into retaliation mode.
So Pinchas killing that Midianite woman who did it, along with the Israelite man who did the bad action, that was not enough of a lesson. They got killed.
Apparently, I don't know, but we're not going to use the word lesson. That may be a little bit prejudicial, but that wasn't enough of a response. How about if we say that?
Okay.
Right? We stopped.
This is actually God saying.
Yeah, and this is not Moses coming up with it. Although Moses, if you're going to read carefully, will make a subtle change in the wording when we get to our next verse.
Okay.
How about it?
Okay. Moses spoke to the people, saying, "Let men be picked out from among you for a campaign, and let them fall upon Midian to wreak the Lord's vengeance on Midian. You shall dispatch on the campaign 1,000 from every one of the tribes of Israel."
Okay. So, anyone pick up on the subtle word changing that Moses used rather than what God used? Right. Which in English?
The revenge of Hashem.
Right. In our first verse, it was the revenge of the children of Israel. And in the second verse, when Moses is telling it to the tribes, he calls it the Lord's vengeance, right? The vengeance of God.
Right.
And it's a very subtle word change, which is also a very obvious word change. Because we might just say, oh, it's just turn of phrase, but the Torah never just has a turn of phrase. We're going to come back to that in our commentaries, so hold your comments until we get there. But notice what the plan is. We're going to have vengeance against them by doing what? But not just military. We just did a massive military census and found out that we had 600,000 or so soldiers. How many are being sent off to fight the Midianites?
12,000.
12,000. 12,000.
Yes.
Why didn't we send off 600,000? Or even just 100,000? I mean, if we wanted to save some for defense of the main encampment. I mean, why are we sending only a fraction?
It's all you need for the mission that they have in mind.
It might be all you need for the mission, or it might be there to underscore something. Remember, what was the Midianites' first attack against us before the whole women of Allure plot?
Passing by their land.
Passing by.
This from the rear.
Nope. Balaam, right? The talking donkey episode. Everyone remembers Balaam by the talking donkey, although he had a lot of other things that were more important. The idea that the Midianites first had was, we'll hire a professional curser who will come and curse the Israelites, and then we'll be able to attack them. Because right now they're too strong because God is giving them protection. And if we can weaken their protection by divine sources, then we'll be able to take them by mundane sources. By reducing the full amount of people who are retaliating against the Midianites, they are highlighting the fact that even a pittance of the Israelites would be able to overcome the Midianites. That what the Midianites feared most was that this host would be able to wipe them out. It doesn't even need the host. All you need is a platoon in order to be able to do it. That's what God's support does. And that shows the depth of their failure to turn God against the Israelites with the idol trap, or to secure a trap by Balaam's cursing.
It also shows that their gods are not as powerful.
And not just their gods, but their sorcery, as is going to come back later in this text. All right, so I keep talking about things that are yet to come, so let's actually get the rest.
So 1,000 from each tribe were furnished from the divisions of Israel, 12,000 picked for the campaign. Moses dispatched them on the campaign, 1,000 from each tribe, with Pinchas, son of Eleazar, serving as a priest on the campaign. equipped with the sacred utensils and the trumpets for sounding the blasts. They took the field against Midian, as the Lord had commanded Moses, and slew every male. Along with their other victims, they slew the king of Midian, Ebi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also put Balaam, son of Beor, to the sword.
Okay. Notice the last guy there, Balaam.
Yeah.
Right? He was the guy who had been the hired cursor that was supposed to be doing this, and this is where he gets his just desserts. And that's coming back to the idea that, well, wait, what was he still doing with them? Because remember, he was brought in, and then when he couldn't curse us, he left. And yet, here he is again. We'll come back to that. All right, so we're going to read just a little bit more of the aftermath in a sec.
I have a question that may be not completely connected.
Okay.
Parsha. In Hebrew, they call him Bila. Why in the English translation?
Yes,
Yeah.
well, because both, I noticed that last time.
Yes.
Incorrect.
Basically, yes. As far as I know, I've never heard a good explanation. I mean, some things we know, like, why are J's always, or why are Y's always done as J's? And that's because that was the symbol for a Y sound in German, right? Like a J in German sounds like a Y. And so when they wrote things with J's, it was meant to mimic the Y sound of the Yud. And then when that German was brought into other Western European languages, they kept the J as a J sound rather than as the German Y sound. So some of those slips I know where they creep in. This, I don't know, because it doesn't seem to me that for English speakers, saying Balaam is any easier than saying Bilam. It's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But that is the convention that we have.
Well, maybe when the King James was translating the Bible, remember there are no vowels in the Hebrew. So they may have just sort of made it up.
Confused.
Bilam, the Balaam got confused.
Well, they got the other names mostly right.
Mostly they
So
got
it
them
would,
right,
it
but
would,
could see
I mean,
that.
there's some things that were changes that were made in order to smooth over English pronunciation. But this one, I don't see how it would have helped.
No, it didn't help.
So
It just didn't
a
help.
curiosity, and if anybody ever wants to dig up, where Bilam became Balaam, I'd be interested to know. But what's that? Right.
Balaam.
Yeah, which is unusual because usually they take out the extra I's
That's right.
rather than add them in. So there we are. All right, aftermath.
The Israelites took the women and children of the Midianites captive and seized as booty all their beasts, all their herds, and all their wealth. And they destroyed by fire all the towns in which they were settled and their encampments. They gathered all the spoil and all the booty, man and beast. And they brought the captives, the booty, and the spoil to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the whole Israelite community at the camp, the steps of Moab, at the Jordan near Jericho.
Okay, so when we're talking vengeance, they're not going and egging their house. This is full-on war and catastrophic to the Midianites. This is not a mild skirmish. Now, when it says that they seized and killed all of this, we know that isn't literally true because Midian continues to be a country after this. And if all was destroyed and all was killed and all was burnt, that would not have continued. So we know that there's a slight, I don't want to use the word hyperbole per se, but a slight broadness in terms that was meant to describe the scale, but not the literal casualty list.
Wasn't Yitro a Midianite?
Yes, he was.
How does that?
Wasn't Zipporah a Midianite, Moses' wife?
We never hear how.
We're going to hear it a little bit today.
Okay.
We actually, the commentators bring up that exact point of, didn't Moses live with these people for 40 years? How did that go down? And how did that feel? And the commentators absolutely picked that up. And then we'll add, of course, our own conversation to that of what we feel about this unfortunate turn of events, to be perhaps a little too diplomatic. But there's one more part of the reverberations that I need to get in before we can look at those commentaries.
Moses, Eleazar the priest, And all the chieftains of the community came out to meet them outside the camp.
Right, here come the returning soldiers with all of the booty, and Moses, the new Kohen Gadol, because remember Aaron is already dead at this time, and all the other leaders, they go out to greet the returning army.
Moses became angry with the commanders of the army, the officers of thousands and the officers of hundreds, who had come back from the military campaign. Moses said to them, "You have spared every female, yet they are the very ones who, at the bidding of Balaam, induced the Israelites to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, so that the Lord's community was struck by the plague."
All right, we're going to pause there, and I'm going to give you a summary of the ramifications. Right, but this one I should understand the issue here, which was the curses of Balaam couldn't do a thing, but his advice to have the women go out and seduce the men into idolatry, that killed 20-some thousand Israelites in the plague. So by bringing the women in, Moses is going, Dumkaf. They were the problem, right? The men couldn't do anything against us. Their military was afraid of us, but their women, they were able to seduce the men into all this idolatry, and that's what got us killed. And you're bringing them home. That's not good thinking. The solution is to kill every woman who is old enough to have been with a man. And therefore, it is the children are allowed to live, but the adults are not. It's rough. It is extremely rough.
The next one says, therefore,
Right.
slay every male among the
Oh
children.
yeah, the male children go too. Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
just like we didn't like they did that to us in Egypt. Killed our male children. Now Moses is saying, now kill the male children.
It was unfortunately standard practice in ancient cultures that if you let the males live, they would grow up to eventually not like you because of what you had done, and therefore it was simply safer to kill them now.
Well, that was Pharaoh's reasoning.
It was indeed. The women, on the other hand, as is mentioned in commentary, go on to be converted and brought in to the Jewish people and married, so that they have I guess you might say, a stake in not rebelling against us. But that's a whole nother conversation. But I want to go back to this whole idea of vengeance in the first place, as well as something else that we kind of glossed over at the very beginning, which was the very interesting sentence structure of verse 2, which is back at the top of 944. I sort of distracted you by talking all about the vengeance side, but what is the second half of that verse? After the vengeance is done, what happens?
Oh, you shall be gathered to your kin.
Yeah. So I've got one more job for you, Moses, and then you're dead. How would you like knowing that as soon as you finish this one job, your time was up? You know, when you're telling your kids, it's bedtime as soon as you finish this homework assignment, as soon as you finish that, fruit, as soon as you finish that cookies and milk, they're going to eat that cookie so slowly. But Moses, not so much.
Although Moses had heard that his death was associated with this matter, he did it loudly and did not delay.
Right? God tells them you need to do the vengeance and then you die. And the very next sentence is Moses preparing for the vengeance. Right? He doesn't put anything in between.
After leading the Jewish people for all those years.
He's had enough.
Enough of it.
Which is hitting the next comment beautifully.
Okay.
Up until the Israelites had heard of his approaching death, what does it state? That Moses felt constrained to exclaim about them, "They are almost ready to stone me."
Right? So as long as Moses had an unlimited reign, so to speak, the Israelites were always arguing with him and always nasty to him and always terrible to him. And so much so that he's like, they're going to kill me for doing this. But
when they heard that Moses' death was associated with carrying out the vengeance upon Midian, they refused to go to war until they were handed over against their will.
Right, so picking up on, again, the oddity in the Hebrew, which is in verse 3, it doesn't just say the people gathered. It says the people were assembled. They were girded for war. And that passive sense, that passive voice, the commentator, in this case, the Rashi, channeling the Midrash, is showing that the people didn't volunteer for the mission. And it wasn't because they were afraid of the mission. They didn't volunteer because they knew as soon as the mission was done, Moses would be gone. And how would you like to do that? You know, sign up for a job knowing that as soon as your job is complete, the guy you like, well, at least now you've decided you like, is going to die. You know, I'm just going to wait until I get called. I don't want to rush this. So Moses was willing to do it. The people were not willing to lose Moses. So eventually they had to be drafted, if you will, into service. And that's one of the only times we see that particular grammar being used, that the people were pulled into the army as opposed to simply gathered. Good? All right. And similarly, Rashbam, who usually argues with his grandfather,
said, 1,000 from each tribe were furnished unwillingly, since they knew that after the vengeance was taken, Moses would be gathered to his kin.
Right. So Rambam and Rashbam and his grandfather Rashi are of the same opinion here, that the Israelites were reluctant, and that's why we have the odd grammar of their summoning the army together, their girding up of the people. But the main topic, I think, really is still here, this whole vengeance notion. Yes? All right, so let's figure out whose vengeance was it in the first place. Because right now we have two contentions. We have it being vengeance of the Israelites and vengeance of God. And we're not talking, when we use those phrases, of who is carrying out the vengeance. We're talking who is being avenged. Right? Does that make sense? Right? So if somebody mistreats my friend and I take vengeance on the person who has bullied them, am I carrying out vengeance on my behalf, or am I carrying out vengeance on my friend's behalf? Presumably my friend, but what if I said, because you mistreat my friend, it made me look bad, and therefore I'm going to take vengeance. Now whose vengeance am I carrying out? Yours? Maybe, right? It's definitely more complicated now. And depending upon who's saying whose vengeance it is, it becomes another layer of complication still. And that's where we're going to start digging in, beginning with Ibn Ezra.
So that would be the Lord's vengeance, is the Israelites' vengeance for the Midianites having lured them into idolatry.
All right, so Ibn Ezra tries to simply harmonize them and sort of not say there's much of a difference here. The Lord's vengeance, that's really the Israelites' vengeance. And why is it called the Lord's vengeance? Because it's associated with the idolatry. And so we're labeling it as the Lord's vengeance only because of the idolatry, but really this is for Israel to get back at Midian for what had been done to them. But the other commentators, they look at a more complicated frame.
It had been decreed that Moses would not cross the Jordan. On this side of the Jordan, however, he was fully in command. He defeated the two great Amorite kings and allocated their territories, and it was also he who should take vengeance on the Lord's enemies. Joshua would not take command until the Israelites entered the land.
All right, so Ramban is already getting ahead of this question of why is Moses being tasked with this, and trying to say because he was the one still in charge. He wasn't done yet. In fact, this would be his done moment, and that meant he had to be the one in charge. Moreover,
the Lord wished to give Moses the honor of applying to him the verse, "The righteous man will rejoice when he sees revenge." And that's from Psalms. That is why he was not to be gathered to his kin until this vengeance was taken.
God was just trying to be nice to Moses, to give him the honor of seeing vengeance taken on his enemies. How do we feel about that idea? That the righteous man will rejoice when he sees revenge. Seems a little weird.
Yeah.
Doesn't sit quite right. Right? We'll wait till you see the second half of the verse. But we're going to have to unpack it in order to truly come to grips with it. But let Ramban sit there uncomfortably in our stomach, because otherwise we can't really digest. You've got to let it percolate a bit. Bamidbar Rabbah has a slightly different take on what's going on here.
It is said, "The righteous shall rejoice when he sees vengeance."
That's our verse before.
Vengeance upon Midian. It says, "He shall wash his feet with the blood of the wicked." This is Balaam.
That's the second half of the verse. Right? So the righteous will not only rejoice when they see vengeance, the righteous will wash their feet with the blood of the wicked. Right? So you will be killing so many that your feet will be completely soaked in the blood of and the blood of these wicked people. But notice, by taking the two parts of the verse, the Midrash is saying there were two different vengeances being carried out here. There was vengeance against Midian, and there was vengeance against Balaam. And we're going to have to figure out why they both were there and what vengeance was going on.
Moses said to Pinchas and to the men of his host, I know that the wicked Balaam is there to receive his reward. Before the wolf comes to the flock, lay out a trap for him.
Right, so Balaam is, according to many of the commentators, expecting to get paid finally. Remember, that was the whole agreement way back at the beginning of Parashat Balak, which was, I'll come kind of with the idea that I'm going to get paid. He tried to do the cursing, that didn't work, but he arranged for the idea of the women to seduce the men, which ended up with 20-some thousand Israelites dead. So he figures he's earned something. So he's come to Midian to collect. Right? It may not have been exactly what they had originally bargained for, but hey, he's definitely worked out to be effective at getting Israelites dead, so it's time to pay up. Make sense? All right.
If you see that wicked one, as we Balaam,
That's Balaam.
you see Balaam doing sorcery and flying in the air of the world, show him the high priest's front plate, the seats.
Right. This what was worn on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol.
And that has written upon it, holy to the Lord, from Exodus, and he will fall and they will kill him. And they killed the kings of Midian upon their slain.
All right. So what does the upon the slain mean? Read the next verse, and then, next sentence, and then we'll go back to the verse.
For they were doing sorceries with Balaam, and they were flying, but when they saw the plate, they fell upon their slain.
All right. So the 5 kings of Midian and Balaam were flying above the battlefield. Bet you didn't get that from the Torah when we read through it. All right. Prepositions. Prepositions are so much fun. We're back in verse 8, and it says very clearly that the kings of Midian, right, Hargu, what's the preposition that comes next for our Hebrew readers? We're in verse 8. Bottom of page 944. Al, right? Al. And what does al usually mean? Upon, on. Well, how? 944, but it's verse 8. Right. So how do you get the kings of Midian to fall upon those that have been killed? You make them fly above, and then they fall upon. Right? It's what the text says. And we know that Balaam was a sorcerer, so therefore, flying around is perfectly normal. Now, you can see that, and indeed other commentators, not only the modern JPS translation, say that the al here does not mean on, but the al here simply means with. And that's why they use the phrase along with the other victims. But even those who said that the on meant literally on top of the other victims, we don't have to assume that they meant that they were literally flying around. But what we are seeing here is the idea that against the sorcery of the other nations stands the concept of the holiness of God. And that the sorcery of other nations is no match. That it will bring down the most mighty sorcerers around when confronted with actual holiness of God. And that contrast, that conflict, if you will, of civilizations is really the direction that most of the commentators go for why this war happened the way it happened and why it needed to happen, and why we're still going to have to be a little bit more careful figuring out of whose vengeance was actually being fought for at this time. Make sense here? Yes?
It's amazing to me how much credence is given to sorcery and magic, and the fact that they had the idea of people flying, even, this is they had experienced, or their parents had experienced miracles.
Right.
but they were still subject to this kind of easy temptation to sorcery and to
Why
see
wouldn't they?
things as magical.
The priests of Egypt did magic
Yes.
that in many cases mimicked the effects of the plagues,
Yes.
which of course to the plague, which shows you what real utility that kind of thing is. The idea that some people would either claim to have or would use some form of behavior to make people believe they had magical powers is not ridiculous to imagine our ancestors believing at all. Why would they not believe that other people had these powers? The idea between natural and supernatural forces, that's a modern line that we draw based upon current research and continues to shift. In the ancient world, it was just people could do stuff. Some people could throw rocks. Some people could talk to God. Some people could make it rain. Some people could make it have lightning. And they just assumed that people who claim to do these sorts of things might be telling the truth. But what they're saying here is, even if there were something as sorcery, standing against God, it's dropping out of the sky.
And it's not that long ago, I can remember people said, evil spirits, you know,
Right.
no evil eyes you get, you kind of, still, even into modern times,
Right.
we still think
Put a
there's
red
something.
band
else.
on your
Yeah, there you go, so.
Yes. Yeah, we may not have people who would actively believe that somebody might be flying around,
Still.
but-
Just in case.
but many people still believe in magical forces, if you will, of more subtle varieties. Although I should point out, I had a friend in high school whose family was taken in by a charlatan, a religious huckster, if you will, who they swore flew around the room. And that was part of their means of convincing them to like sign over their house and money to this guy, was because they saw him do miracles like fly. And therefore, and they really believed it. It was very sad, the way this whole family collapsed in this charlatanry. But I mean, they honestly believed that they had witnessed him fly. And therefore, everything that he claimed that they should do was perfectly acceptable. And that's not a new idea. That's been going around for a while.
They've been using that same act
But
for
when you
3,500 years.
but when you hold up, you
You
know,
got them.
the clay kodesh, the holy implements, the holy vessels, the illusion crumbles. And this is answering the other question of, why did Pinchas have to bring these other items? I mean, when they're going off to war, why are they bringing random, you know, priestly accoutrement when what you really need are spears and bows and shields? And the answer is that ultimately this is the antidote to that type of sorcery, or at least that type of belief in sorcery. All right, let's go ahead and go back to our question of Moses' participation in this, because that's going to reopen our question of whose vengeance is this anyway.
The plain text appears to charge Moses personally with having to wreak this vengeance.
Right? You see, first line of 944, verse 2, right? When God tells Moses to seek revenge, does he say that some delegate to someone to seek revenge? Say, take revenge. It's a direct command. But Moses delegates. Okay, why?
However, seeing that Moses had been raised in Midian and had been saved from Pharaoh's vengeance during all his years there, it would not have been moral for him to do this himself, just as he did not strike the river Nile during the plagues, as that river, that is its banks, had helped save his life when he was an infant.
Right, so we are adding a layer here of morality that comes from connectedness. That if you have a connection, if you have a relationship, then you can't really be an instrument of vengeance against that group. Which has actually been shown psychologically and sociologically to be true, that the more connectedness that people have, the less strife and violence there is between them. The more people of different backgrounds, faiths, religions, sexual orientations, pick any category that people will often strife over, the more you sit them down and have coffee together, they don't even have to agree. They just need to be with each other as human beings. the less likely anyone from those groups is going to take violent action or even necessarily non-violent but negative action against the other groups. It's called the contact theory of social change. And it's been fairly well established to be one of the most powerful means of getting people to stop hurting each other, is to actually just let them share time. It's why there are many activities now in Israel that try to get Israelis and non-Israelis to spend time together, not solving the world's problems, but just spending time together. And it has shown a very good effect at making people much less likely to then take violent action against each other. So we see here that, hundreds of years ago, our commentators also knew that, but there's no way Moses is going to walk into Midian and start killing people, even though that's what he knows has to be done. And we're going to get back to the why does it have to be done part in a minute, but he himself cannot be at the spear point of that action.
Because of the book that I'm reading for another book club, this almost is an explanation for why during World War II, Japanese here were interned in camps, because they were afraid. If you had Midianites in the middle of you, you might want to put them apart because you don't understand them and you think they may have a relationship back to their home country of Japan. That's very psychologically interesting.
And the people who knew them best, the people who actually knew the Japanese best, knew that they were not fifth columnists, that they were not going to be traitors, and that they were not going to do that at all. It was the people who didn't know them in Washington and other places, because they were mostly a West Coast population, that didn't, which is also, by the way, well, and then people preyed upon that immediately. But to prove it further, the one place that you would have thought would have the most anti-Japanese feeling was Hawaii. They did not inter their Japanese residents. Why? Because they were a mainstream part of the community, and everybody in the community knew them. And everybody knew that they were okay, because everybody knew them. And so they were not going to ship them off to Idaho.
But from Washington, far away from California, where many of them were, they didn't understand.
Well, they didn't understand, and as my mother was pointing out, there were powerful lobbying interests that really encouraged this because of the financial gain. So, yeah. Look it up. It's very unfortunate. One of the blacker parts of American history.
Yes, I've been reading a little bit about it. I was surprised at how much I don't know about.
Was the Japanese also singled out because they could be identified?
Well,
it didn't hurt, which is why.
Why did they put the Germans?
Because they could identify.
Or the Italians.
Because they could be identified.
Yes. Now there was a.
Explain that to the Chinese and to the Koreans who were in, like, my mom was from LA County, and they just, took people
who looked.
literally, if they were,
What's that?
They looked Asian.
Some did, yes.
And you were
Some did.
Oh, you gone also.
Right.
I mean, I didn't realize they lost their homes, they lost their businesses, just like the Jews in Europe will lose their stuff.
Yes, very comparable, and did not receive compensation when they returned.
That's correct. I did not know that.
And we have to remember that the Japanese internment, and then we'll get back to Midian, but it comes after decades of special distinction of anti-Asian policies. Immigration policies for Japan and China were much stricter, to the point eventually of having zero being allowed to immigrate, than for European countries or other countries. There was a very racial hierarchy of which colored people will we let in and not let in, and in what proportion. And it was not down to what skills you had. It was entirely down to what race you were.
And I thought they were just giving Jews out.
Oh, no, that too. Remember, we were part of a race in the mind of the government. So.
There were regulations against the Chinese.
Yes.
Right.
I don't know about the Japanese at the time, but the Chinese were certainly discriminated against.
Yes.
In California because about their ability to get jobs.
Yes, and it's really, we don't have enough time to go into all the details, but it just was a horrible, horrible part of American history that doesn't get understood or shared enough. Unfortunately, we don't have time to share more of it today.
But all these years after we learned about Midian, we still didn't do any better.
How often do people stay away from people that are different from them, rather than saying, you know what, let me get to know this person. Then I might still decide I don't like him, but I probably will not still hate them. And that's okay. Right? You're allowed not to like individuals, but when we group entire groups that have not done anything, or whose nation has not done anything against us simply because they're different, then that's a problem. But here they had done something against us to bring us back to vengeance. And now we got Moses out of it, which means other people have to be put in charge, which is going to lead to the problem of bringing home the ladies. And therefore, the little paragraph, Rashi, yeah. Moses' anger.
Rashi, yes, Moses' anger. Okay, that's right. Moses' anger with the commanders serves to teach that every misdeed of a generation is attributed to the leaders, since these have the power to protest.
Right, which is the great burden of being a leader, is that if people that you are leading do something wrong, it's your fault. You share the burden of their guilt. You can't just say, he did it. It's they did it, and I'm part of them. And I am more responsible than them for ensuring it hadn't happened, because I was put in a position of authority that was meant to prevent misdeeds from happening. So that's why when Moses is angry, he doesn't say that he's angry at the soldiers. He says he's angry at the leaders, at the commanders. But he doesn't single out Pinchas, unusually, which is why Tur HaRuch is going to give his commentary. This is also known as Baal HaTurim, the one who wrote the Tur, which was the predecessor to the Shulchan Aruch.
Moses did not display anger at Pinchas, seeing that Hashem himself had granted him the covenant of peace.
So why didn't Pinchas kill all the people? Because he had breached shalom. He had a covenant of peace. He wasn't supposed to be killing people anymore. Remember, we talked a little bit before about Pinchas, that he was the killer in the first. And what does God reward him with? A covenant of peace, almost as a semi-antidote for what he had done. And here we see that the one guy you would imagine who would be most keen to kill the Midianite women who had lured the men into idolatry, because he had done it right in the middle of the town square, not only didn't kill them, but doesn't get chewed out for not killing them. And that's because he now is under a breach shalom. He is not allowed to do those sorts of things. He is under this covenant of peace. So it's interesting how we're working out of this vengeance. But still, we have to figure out, why was this happening? Why was this vengeance even needed if we were done with them, as we had said before? We've broken away from their spell of seductive idolatry, and we were moving on. We weren't supposed to occupy and live in their territory, so we didn't need to stay here. We didn't need anything else to do with them. But there's a lesson.
On the Midianites, not on the Moabites.
Oh, the Moabites, right. Remember them? They were involved way back in Parashat Balak. But we're doing revenge against Midian. Why isn't it revenge against Midian and Moab? Why?
Because the Moabites only got involved because they were afraid of the Israelites. It's true that the Israelites were told in Deuteronomy not to fight with the Moabites, but the Moabites still feared that they might plunder them.
Right, so why did the Moabites fight? Why were they trying to stop the Israelites?
Because they were afraid the Israelites would come after them.
Because they were afraid. And that doesn't mean we don't fight back against them, but it does mean we're not taking vengeance against them, because we understood their motivation. They saw us as this rampaging horde, and even though our rampaging horde wasn't as rampagey as many others and had limits to it, they didn't quite have the trust that we would behave that way, that this horde was different than all other hordes. And so they fought, and when we fought back, we stopped them, and then we stopped because we were not supposed to fight them anymore, and that was the limit that God had given us. But the Midianites, we weren't threatening the Midianites. I mean, we weren't even looking threatening to the Midianites directly. So why did they do it?
The Midianites, though, interfered in a quarrel that had nothing to do with them. Another reading. You must not go to war against the Moabites or the Ammonites, Deuteronomy, because of the two sweet doves I have yet to bring forth from them. Ruth the Moabite, the great-grandmother of King David, and Naaman the Ammonite, wife of King Solomon and mother of King Rehoboam.
Right, so another reason why we wouldn't want to attack them is because there were good people who were going to come out of them eventually. And so we can't, if you kill them now, you don't get the good person later. And that is a very powerful lesson that, even though this may be an enemy now, down the road, something very good may come from them. Midianites, on the other hand, they're sticking their nose in here for What reason? Why would you get involved in a war that wasn't actually a danger to you? No one ever watches like the news. Why do people go to war? If they're not afraid, what reason do people go to war? Territory, profit, right? You go to war because of what you can get out of it. If you think there's a reason that you can gain, you go to war. At least that was the classical model for most of human history. Or you go to war because you're afraid of losing. Afraid, or you're thinking you're going to be victorious. The Moabites were afraid, so they tried to fight us first. Okay, we don't exactly go along with that. We're certainly going to stop them. But the Midianites, they weren't afraid. They were greedy. They thought they could capitalize on this opportunity. And therefore, they receive a vengeance that's much, much stronger. But again, who is this vengeance really about? Finally get to our punchline.
Some commentators, such as Nachmanides, see in this a promise that Moses will live to see and enjoy the revenge on his enemies.
Remember the text that we read at the beginning about the righteous will be able to see the vengeance of the others and bathe their blood bathe their feet in the blood of the wicked, and that this is getting to see the revenge on his enemies. But
Tanchuma Makot points out that whereas the Torah, that is God, speaks of a vengeance for Israel, Moses in turn speaks about a vengeance for God when he tells the Israelites the purpose of the punitive campaign against Midian in verse 3.
Right, so Rabbeinu Bachya is slightly disagreeing with Ramban, with Nachmanides. He's saying this isn't about Moses getting to see vengeance on his enemies. Because Moses, when he talks to the people, doesn't say, we're getting vengeance on our enemies. He says, we're getting vengeance for God. And by recasting what's happening here, he is highlighting what was really at stake. And that's why we'll continue.
Moses is quoted by the Midrash as saying to God, "Oh Lord, if we had been uncircumcised, or even circumcised but worshiping idols, the Midianites would not have hated us. Why then do they hate us? Because of the Torah and the commandments which you have given us. Therefore, it is your vengeance." The concept behind all this is that anyone who attacks the Jewish people actually aims at the God of the Jewish people and uses the Jewish people as God's alter ego.
Well, you can't hit God, so you have to hit the surrogate. For all of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and most of the 80s, the United States and Russia were engaged in proxy wars. I mean, they couldn't fight each other, because if they did, the world would be wiped out. But they could fund wars throughout the Middle East and throughout Central America and Latin America and Southeast Asia and Africa. You could have proxy wars. And it was fighting over the ideas that both those countries stood for, as well as some other geopolitical things, by, what's that? And money. Yeah. So not trying to claim anybody was perfectly pure in this, but there was definitely an idea that the real people who wanted to fight couldn't fight. And so instead you had a different level of the fight. And in here, what Rabbeinu Bachya is introducing by that weird flip between Israel's vengeance and then God's vengeance is that the real fight between Midian and Israel wasn't between Midian the state and Israel the state, or the people, but it was between Midian and the idea of God that we were now carrying into the world. And we needed to fight back against those who would try to extinguish that idea. Those who were just afraid of us, we just had to stop them. But those who wanted to extinguish the idea of God in the world, we had to fight more aggressively in order to make sure that fight was never lost, because that was bigger than us, and that was bigger than our honor or our vengeance that was needed. Because against the Moabites, which was really more about us, we did not take vengeance. But to stop those who would stop God and the idea of what God represented in this world, that we had to fight more strongly, which is why they go through such lengths to highlight that the victory that comes from our retaliation against the Midianites is completely God's victory by reducing the army down to a bare representation. Excuse me. I will call that person back later. By reducing the army down to a bare representation to show that this is not us, the people, us, the nation, us, our own military winning. This is the idea of God defeating the sorcery of Balaam, the sorcery of the Midianite kings, this other worldview that was what Torah was coming to replace. And in those cases, the war was needed. But when we can find ways to avoid it, as we talked about with the Brit Shalom of Pinchas, or the relationship that Moses had with Midian, we avoid it. Or even just, we don't retaliate against people that attacked in fear. We stop them, but we stop short of additional retaliation.
You said before that, when you have a connection with people, it helps to understand better. And Yitro was a priest, probably well-known and influential. And then Moses, we don't really know what his influence was beyond his family there. But these are two pretty significant personalities living amongst these people, which did not affect later on the feeling of these people with the children of Israel.
Correct. Unfortunately, Moses and Zipporah and Yitro were not enough to say, oh, therefore all the Midianites must be nice. Instead, it was more, these are the people who have left Midian, and we can see now what the rest of Midian thinks of us, which is another thing the commentators point out. Why were all 5 kings listed? Why not just say the Midianites? And they say because all of Midian, all factions of Midian were united against us, and therefore we had to retaliate against all of the Midianite factions. But it would have been nice, yes, if we had been able to, if they had been able to understand us and we had been able to understand them. But it's the first part that is the more difficult, because what we were offering wasn't ultimately a challenge to their entire power structure of a society built on idolatry, which is built around the theme of exploitation and theme of duping people into the ideas of sorcery, and the idea that curses and blessings and all of that are something to be wielded rather than what is simply infused into the world by God. That was something that we can't accept. And there is a limit to that contact theory. If you put me down and tell me to beat chummy with a neo-Nazi, I'm not going to hate him because he comes from a particular city. I'm not going to hate him or others from his family that don't share his views. But those views I will stand diametrically opposed to with my dying breath. And I will argue and chastise against everything that he says that espouses those views. I'll recognize him as a human, but I'm not going to let that continue to grow. And just as that type of neo-Nazi or fascist and other forms of ideas in our day are something that we have to keep talking against, in their day, they had to fight against idolatry, which was the more pervasive evil in their era.
Being a Indian priest, was this a kind of a local?
Apparently. I mean, Midrash will cast Jethro as a much higher status sometimes. But yes, it doesn't seem that he wasn't enough of a muckety-muck to stop Midian from doing what it tried to do to us. And it may be precisely because Jethro was a little different that he was able to recognize what God had done, was able to recognize Moses, was able to recognize the Israelites as being something special. And that might have alienated him from his original Midian roots.
Some of the rabbis say that actually he converted.
Yes,
Judaism.
Absolutely, yes. It's
they said it's in the Bible. He said a simple servant saw more than I can see.
Exactly.
And I need to be with these people.
Right, and I'm a high priest of Midian, and the lowest guy was able to experience the divine more than I ever could as a high priest. I need to get with the program, exactly.
Almost 40 years later.
Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, the impact, I mean,
Jethro would have almost certainly been dead at this point.
Yes.
Yes.
Probably his Moses' wife.
Zipporah, I don't remember a particular midrash about when she passes, because she's certainly not named as dying in the Torah, but I don't remember a midrash. but I would assume that she did not live as long as him, but she might have been younger than him when they got married. It's an interesting question. But yes, the connections to Midian would not have been as strong 40 years after Moses had left.
But he
then,
fulfilled also a kinship because of the connection.
Oh, I mean, we say of Egypt over and over again in the Torah that we don't hate the Egyptians for what they did to us, because they did also take us in during the time of famine, and we were allowed to live there. So there is a certain respect that's given because of that past relationship, and that's not limited only to Moses. All right, good. Thank you for a lively discussion.